your talk. So let's welcome Suzanne.
Can you all see all right? Can you all hear me all right? Yeah, I'll stand up here. Is that better? How's that? Is that all right? Marvellous. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. As you can see, I'm here tonight to talk to you of the story of Puss, Pops and Privies. Now, it's not a story I intended to write, actually. This was going to be the third of a trilogy of disasters about Sheffield. I quite like disasters. So when I mean disasters, it's in terms of the death toll for Sheffield. So, and when I used to work at the local studies library, they were known as the Big Three. So there's the Sheffield Blitz, of course, did a talk on that. The Sheffield Flood, the one from 1864, I've done a talk on that. And so the final one was about the cholera epidemic of 1832, which had a huge death toll. So I started to research that, and as I started it and looked into it, I realised that actually this was only part of the story. This was only really the beginning of those awful, awful epidemics that had such a devastating effect on our Victorian ancestors. You know, so I started to look into, well, why did it suddenly start then? Why did it have such a massive impact at that time? And how did we manage to overcome it to become the kind of healthy society that we are today? So that's what the talk ended up being about, and I really struggled about the title as well. I tried several variations, but when I renamed it Puss, Pops and Privies, it became so popular. I've got the title. So that's what the story is going to be about tonight. So, now do you want the lights dimmed a bit?
Yes.
That over there. Uh-huh. Oh, lovely. How's that? Alright.
Can you put that one on, please?
Cute.
Yeah, it's alright. Excellent. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Thank you.
Smashing up the back row.
Who was that? So, in order to understand why it was so bad, of course you really need to understand about the effects of industrialisation on Sheffield. And of course at the beginning of the 19th century, Sheffield was still relatively small, had a stable population, it was 31,000, but of course, you know, due to the increase in trade and work that was being created in Sheffield and the number of people that started to move in, that started to have a significant impact. So the early part of the 1800s, the population was stable. But then, in 1841, the population had doubled over the previous 20 years. Completely unprecedented, you know, the likes of which had never been seen before. And consequently, we really struggled to try to keep on top of all these people suddenly moving in. But it didn't stop there. In fact, it got much worse. In the next 20 years, the population tripled. The next 20 years, the population doubled again. And it's not surprising that the authorities in Sheffield really struggled to try to keep a hold of all these overcrowding situations and all the sanitary conditions. And it was really like a frontier town. They didn't know when it was going to stop. They didn't know what was going to happen. So, the effects on Sheffield, obviously, was very significant. The living conditions were awful, as overcrowding was such a problem that they were just creating all kinds of housing in the smallest nooks and crannies, and there was no control over house building at that time, so you could throw any old hovel, and people were. And consequently, there's a quote from the time, this is from the 1840s, from a doctor who was investigating the condition of the town. He said, overcrowded and unsanitary conditions were commonplace, as the city grew at too rapid a pace to be able to accommodate the sudden influx of people. In 1839, Dr. Holland described scenes of wretchedness that so appalled him, he often insisted on them going to the workhouse, simply for protection from cold and hunger. So actually you're better off going into the workhouse than living in the slum areas of Sheffield. That's saying how bad things were. And of course one of the problems really was the poor water supply. Now, people tended to get water from two main sources. There were the standpipes that were available in the courtyards of the back-to-back houses, but water wasn't readily available. They only switched the water on certain times of the day, certain days of the week. So on average, water was only switched on for about 6 hours a week, which is not very much. So you've got to know when it's being switched on, you've got to go there, collect your water and store it. Of course, people didn't know about germs in those days, so there's no concept of hygiene at all. And if you got your water from the wells instead, well, the wells were very shallow and easily contaminated from all the horrendous gunge that was running around in the streets and going into the water supply. And this quote really sums it up. It is a question worth serious consideration whether the bad water supply of the period was not largely to blame for the great consumption of alcohol amongst all classes of society. And really you would, wouldn't you? Given the choice between this awful water and the beer, you'd go for the beer. And of course people were much better off drinking the beer, although again at the time they didn't know that. And another main problem, of course, were the toilets. The toilets, mainly at that time, were privy middens. These are the privy middens. And of course, it means that they're not connected to the system. You can't flush them. So what you would do, you'd lift this lid up, and inside there would be a bucket that would have to be emptied by these poor chaps here, the night soil men. And it wasn't a regular service that came to empty. If your bucket was full, you would have to notify the authorities it was full, and they would have to come and empty it. And imagine how long that process would take. And of course, the toilet wasn't your own. You'd be sharing it with many other people on the street. So it soon got full and unusable. Now, one of the main problems really was the lack of public services in these early days. There were lots of organisations responsible for lots and lots of different things. So you've got the police, for example, responsible for the cleaning and lighting of the town. You've got the town trustees that were responsible for drainage and sewage, but only in public areas. And of course, a lot of Sheffield at that time was still privately owned. And of course, the biggest landowner was the Duke of Norfolk. An absentee landowner is no good because they're not interested in investing in the condition of the town. And so consequently, all these little different public services that were responsible for different things didn't want to know. They just kept trying to blame somebody else. And consequently, lots of arguments ensued and nothing got done. A bit of a familiar story, really. Some things just don't change, do they? Now, there certainly were lots of diseases around before industrialisation, the likes of things like, smallpox and measles, things like that, and nothing new. But of course the difference was, come industrialisation, and come these overcrowding conditions, these terrible sanitary conditions, it meant that as soon as somebody in one of these overcrowded courtyards got something like polio or measles, it just spread like wildfire throughout these overcrowded conditions, and consequently lots and lots of people were affected. And another problem, of course, they didn't understand what was causing it, and they certainly didn't know how to cure it. So what they tended to do was treat symptoms instead. And so there were two main remedies. You were either ill because your system was overexcited. So if you'd got a high fever or an inflammation or something like that, you're overexcited. You need to be calmed down. So bleeding was very popular. That's going to calm your system down. Or the other option was that your system needs to be stimulated. So if you've got some kind of wasting disease, something like TB, then it needs to have some powerful stimulants. And opium was a very popular one, especially with the patients. Now, there were lots of wonderful, weird cures around at the time. So you got things like sit on a bucket of chamomile flowers, which was seen to cure diarrhea and upset stomachs. And actually, there is some connection between chamomile and soothing an upset stomach. But of course the idea is you drink it, you don't sit on it. You've got drink Mr. Cooper's blood mixture, which was seen as a powerful stimulant. Touch a skull, I've no idea at all what that was for. Eat live snails. Ooh, has anybody got any theory what that was for? I'd be amazed if you guess it. It was seen to cure TB. So the idea is you get a live snail, and it's got to be a small one because you swallow it whole, and it will then crawl into your lungs and eat away all the bacteria that is causing TB. Applied cow dung as a poultice was also very popular. Well, you can imagine what that's going to do to an oat wound. You know, it's not good. Ride a donkey 27 times in the circle and seem to be a cure for whooping cough. I've no idea. But chloridine was seen as a miracle drug of the 19th century. Has anybody actually had chloridine? Because it's been around until the 20th century. You have. Well, I think that when you had it, the ingredients have probably changed somewhat. Because the main ingredients in the 19th century, here we go, up here, morphine was the main ingredient, followed by cannabis. You can see why it was called the miracle drug of the 19th century, and why it was so popular.
When I was very young, I had a bottle with it. It was my mother's cure-all.
Ooh, was it?
I bought one when I first got married, and it still had morphine in it.
Did it?
Yeah.
Excellent.
But my husband laughed because it said it was a cure for diarrhea and coughing.
Yes. So, the cholera heads our way. Now, the cholera is nothing new. It's been around for centuries, but really it was a term that was applied to any kind of stomach disorders. But this was different. It was called the Asiatic cholera, and it spread throughout Asia, it spread throughout Russia, and it spread throughout Europe. And the difference is that it was killing people in their thousands. Nobody knew what was causing it, nobody knew how to cure it, and it was killing rich people as well as poor people. And when it started to head towards our shores, we did not want it in this country. We tried to quarantine the country, but it's 1831, it's badly organised, we didn't know what it was doing, and before long it had arrived on our shores, and it arrived at Sunderland. And when the first victim died, an artist was sent to that victim to paint them, so that this image could then be reproduced and sent to all the doctors around the country, so that they would be able to recognise a death by cholera of anybody in their area, so they'd know if it had spread. And that is that painting of that first victim. She was just a 12-year-old girl. Although how you're supposed to identify this as the cholera, as opposed to the many other things people were dying of at that time, I'm not quite so sure. You know, they got the right idea, but, you know, it's still too early for them to get it right. So, we were most concerned about the spread of the disease in this country. And so, for the first time, the government used public money to set up regional health boards around the country and made local areas responsible for the health of their local people. So, because we didn't know what was causing it, the advice that we gave people was that the cholera attacks chiefly the dirty, the drunken, the idle and the disorderly. Those, therefore, who wish to escape the cholera should be sober, industrious, steady, and keep themselves and their houses clean. So actually it was also used as a form of social control, as well as trying to stop the spread of the cholera. And of course they wouldn't understand the cause, not until Dr. Snow's experiments in 1859 in London. And of course it was caused by bacteria in the water. But as I said, for a long time we were completely unaware of this. So consequently the advice that we gave people, you know, wasn't, unfortunately, not to drink the water. So this is one of the posters that was put around town to advise people on how to avoid the cholera. And it's telling people to be temperate in eating and drinking, which unfortunately is probably the worst advice, because again, as we know, you're better off drinking the beer than you are the water. It's telling people to avoid raw vegetables and unripe fruit. Now they did think that raw fruit and vegetables was bad for you, but then again, if it's washed in the local water, it would be. And it's saying to abstain from cold water when heated, and above all from ardent spirits. Then it goes on to say, but if habit had rendered them indispensable, take much less than usual. Certainly was lots of alcoholics around at that time. Also telling people to sleep and clothe warm. Do not sleep or sit in a draught of air and avoid getting wet. Well, you know, the fact that so few people bathed in those days, that wasn't really much of a problem. So, what we did in Sheffield, the local health authority set up a free healthcare. They set up the House of Recovery, set up in the workhouse, so it would be somewhere where people could go if they were showing symptoms of the cholera. They could go to the House of Recovery and they would be looked after and nursed back to health in a lovely environment as they saw it, completely free of charge. They also set up a public dispensary, a chemist, where again you could go any time of the day or night for free medicines, again if you were showing any sign or symptoms of the cholera. They also employed medical inspectors to go around people's houses to make sure they were keeping their houses clean. Because again, they thought it was the miasmas, the bad air, that was causing the cholera. And so they forced people to whitewash their houses and to keep the windows and doors open at all times, which didn't go down very well in Sheffield. So the public attitude, you know, the authorities really thought they were doing the best for the local people, that they were taking care of their welfare. And they said, it is confidently believed the poor inhabitants of Sheffield are too wise to remain at home and die, and would rather go to the Cholera House of Recovery to be looked after. But of course, as you know, Sheffield people aren't like that. They don't like being told what to do. So the reality was, we prefer to take our chance of cholera than be bullied into hell. Nobody's going to tell us what to do, especially the fact that the House of Recovery was in the workhouse. Who was going to volunteer to go there to be looked after? And they're also very suspicious of hospitals because they couldn't help noticing that when people went into hospital, they often did come out again. So therefore, it's not a good place to go. And there are also lots of suspicions and rumours about nurses smothering annoying patients or patients that didn't look like they were going to last the night, just so they could get rid of them and get that bed free. And actually, at the time, there probably was something in that. Now, all this public money was being spent on trying to prevent the spread of the cholera. You know, 9 months later, there was still no sign of the cholera in the local area, and we're starting to get a bit fed up of the huge amounts of money we've been spending. And again, a quote, when the disease persistently delayed its appearance, the public gradually ceased to worry about it and objected strongly to any restrictions. Even the local paper quoted, the alarm is entirely groundless. And again, you know, this is something that keeps reoccurring today, with all the money that's been spent on trying to prevent the various flus. And of course, look at this, so far it hasn't quite materialised. And so, you know, we object to the huge amounts of money. And things are just exactly the same in 1831 and 1832. But unfortunately, the difference was there, is that the cholera did arrive in Sheffield. It arrived in June 1832 and it started killing people, you know, in huge numbers. And what scared people is how quickly people were dying. Again, a quote from the time, the fatal scourge was most virulent in August, when inhabitants were often shocked at seeing in the evening the hasty funeral of friends they had seen walking the streets in the morning in apparent health. And it really did get people that quickly. So the local newspaper had to get on board, and they published every week the numbers of people suffering from the cholera, because if they didn't do that, rumours would have made those figures 10 times, 100 times worse. So this example is telling us that from the 3rd of July, 43 new cases have been reported. 14 people had died, but 37 had recovered, but there are now 184 people suffering from the cholera. The following day, on the 4th of July, another 72 new cases have been reported. Another 16 people had died, but 45 people had recovered, but there are now 198 people suffering from the cholera. And as the week progressed, that number got worse and worse, and by the end of the week there were 287 people suffering from the cholera. And again, as the summer started to take hold and the weather got warmer, those figures went up and up. Now again, we didn't know what was causing it, and we certainly didn't know what to cure it. So different doctors have got different ideas on how to cure it. Some thought it was an overexcited system, so therefore bleeding was the answer. Warm baths was seen to be a cure. No idea why. Laudanum and brandy was popular, again, particularly with the patients. Stimulation of the spine, again, no idea why they thought that was good. Salt and warm water was seen to make people sick, and they thought that was a good thing. Carbonate of soda, again, have no idea. Inhale pure hydrogen. Again, anybody any idea what effect that would have had? It was being a bit like inhaling helium, but would have made your voice even higher. Now, why they thought that was a good thing for curing the cholera, I have no idea. But calomel and opium, again, were seen as the main drugs, the main cures for the time. Anybody know what the main ingredient of calomel was? Is it what, sir? Oh, that's far too gentle. Far too gentle. The main ingredient was mercury. Mercury and opium. Kill or cure, really. Mainly kill. And actually, this quote from a doctor shows how scared people were getting. He said, I know several cases where depression of spirits has been the chief, if not the only, cause of death. People were literally worrying themselves to death over this disease because they really didn't know. They started to get a stomachache, a headache, sore throat. Is that it? Were they going to be dead by the end of the day? They really didn't know. And in terms of burials, they thought a dead body was much more contagious than a live one. So people were buried within hours of dying, and there was only certain churchyards that could cope with this huge turnover. So again, they put an announcement in the local paper saying where to take your victims to. And so it was St Philip's. Do you all know where St Philip's was? St Philip's Road, that's right, down the Shalesmore area, yeah. St Mary's, Bramble Lane, yeah. St George's, opposite the university, that's right, yeah. Attercliffe and Ecclesall. But eventually they couldn't cope either. And so the Duke of Norfolk gave a piece of land at Claywood and a huge pit was buried. And after then, everybody was then buried in this pit. And of course that is now the site of the Cholera Monument just above the railway station. And of course, if people were buried within hours of dying, are you sure they're dead? And this did lead to a return. There were concerns. And they said the soporific drugs, which were freely administered, produced on the weak and half-famished bodies of the poor the appearance of death. They had the symptoms of death without actually being dead. And this led to a debate in the local newspaper. What are we going to do about it? And somebody wrote in and said, would it not be practicable and effectual to prevent resuscitation before closing the coffin by some unoffensive method, such as close the ceiling, the mouth and nostrils. So let's just smother them, before we put the lid on. Make sure they're dead. So if they wake up, they'll be smothered anyway, so they can't wake up. So, it really did lead to a significant debate. So, the cholera ran its course, and it came to an end on Christmas Eve, 1832. And at that time, there had been over 1,300 cases reported. 403 people had died of it within that 6-month period. But 945 people had recovered. So actually, more people recovered than what died. However, 1 in 3 people still died. That's not good odds. You don't really want a disease around with those kinds of odds. But what shocked the authorities is how much they spent on it. Remember, this is the first time they'd used public money to try to prevent the spread of an epidemic, to promote the health of the local people. And so this is the figures and the amount of money at the time, and this is the modern day equivalent. And this is just in the local area. So they'd spent a total of almost £250,000 trying to prevent the spread of the disease. Because the figure was much higher nationally. And the government was not impressed about this. And so consequently, public health was very high on the agenda after this, as they tried to improve the health of the nation and therefore to prevent any kind of diseases like that spreading again. So, how are we going to do this? Well, we need a report. We need an investigation on what the health of the nation is like. So, there was a massive investigation which led to, in 1842, the report of the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain. And it was grim reading. Really, really grim reading. And it shocked many people. So some of the findings that it had for Sheffield, by 1843 the population had reached 100,000 and was still growing. Remember, this is a time when the population of Sheffield tripled. And within a mile radius of the cathedral there were no green spaces at all. It was all brick and grim and it was grimy. Poor families still sharing their homes with hens and pigs, because of course a lot had come from the countryside, and that's what you did when they lived in the country. Why should it be any different when you live in a town? So consequently, these back-to-back houses in the courtyards often had chickens running around in them, or pigsties in the backyard. No drainage at all. The only kind of drainage, again, if you can see on this picture, this channel that's being cut through into one tiny, tiny drain. Well, that's still going to get blocked with all kinds of gunge. The filth on the streets had to be removed by hand. They burned barrels of tar to clear the miasmas, the bad smells. Well, that's hardly going to help the smell. And now fevers were endemic. As soon as it got caught in one courtyard, again, it just spread down the street. So cholera, typhoid, polio, etc. became deadly. And so, some of the descriptions from that report: a yard in Bridge Houses. Do you all know where Bridge Houses is? Down Nursery Street, that kind of area. Has a privy accommodating 8 or 10 families, the cesspit of which is placed close to the walls of a house situated on the lower level. The drainage through the walls and into the cellar is most offensive. The occupant of this house has recently lost her husband from consumption and 3 children from fever. She has 2 young children still living, but in a very unhealthy state. And of course, he said the water supply is still a problem. By now, 80% of the population of Sheffield are using water pumps. 20% are using wells. But the water pumps were often next to churches and churchyards, and were described as almost pure essence of churchyard. Imagine what's going on there. Not something you want to drink at all. And of course, water still not switched on. It was only switched on for 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. So still only available 6 hours a week. And so people had to store it, and again, were not storing their water in any kind of hygienic situation. They often became stagnant and foul, but they didn't realise that that was a problem. And the sewage was no better. In 3 parallel streets, again this is around the Kelham Island area, which are neither sewered, drained, paved or cleansed, with a population of 386 persons, there are but 2 small single privies, and these in such a state as to be totally unavailable. And bear in mind that diarrhoea was rife, and there's no toilet. You know, what are you going to do with it? Well, the streets was the answer. And of course, the soil had to be removed manually from the privy midden. So again, the night soil men again with the buckets and emptying it into a cart. And I do like this quote, again from the report. A woman, in passing through a dark entry leading from one street to another, fell into the refuse of an undefended privy, and but for assistance of neighbours, just suffocated. Oh, what a way to go! Oh. So, in Sheffield, we started to identify causes of death. Now, anybody that's done the family history will know that civil registration, birth, marriages and deaths, started to be recorded from 1837. And so for the first time, we were recording causes of death. So when that started in Sheffield, we kept a tally of what people were dying of to try to understand if there were any epidemics in our town we needed to be aware of. Now, of course, the recording of death was much more vague in those days. And of course, in the early days, you didn't need a doctor either to sign a death certificate. You know, anybody could do it. So, consequently, causes of death are somewhat different and a lot more vague than what they are today. So, for example, you've got apoplexy, killed 87 people in this 5-year period. You know, what is apoplexy? And you've got some really big ones. Debility, killed 519. Decay of nature. How can you just die of decay of nature? But it killed 800 people and they've got it on their death certificates. Decline. How can you just decline? But again, 346 people did. And then you've got things like convulsions, killed 919 people. Dentition, killed 426. Of course, these would have been infants, small children. You've got general inflammation, killed 280. Fever, killed 255. Inflammation of the lungs, of course, a big killer, 874. So, you know, you can see how big some of these are. Consumption, of course, was by far the biggest killer. But there were some epidemics that were killing people. Measles, killed 330. Paralysis, which would have been polio, 107. Scarlet fever, killed 550. Smallpox, killed 315. Whooping cough, killed 287. So, yes, you have got signs of these epidemics starting to rise. And of course, TB was, as we saw, by far the biggest. And actually, TB's been around for a long, long time. And even by 1650, it was the leading cause of death in the country. And so, when we looked at our statistics for that 5-year period, we found that, yes, indeed, it was the biggest cause of death in Sheffield. Now, we recorded TB as phthisis. That was what was recorded on the death certificates. So in the first year where civil registration was recorded, 1837 to 1838, 20% of the local population died of TB. That's 1 in 5. That's a lot of people. The following year it had dropped somewhat to 11%, but then it started to rise again, and by 1840 it was back up to almost 1 in 5. There were some diseases that were declining. Smallpox, of course, thanks to the introduction of the vaccination, you know, back at the end of the 1700s by Edward Jenner. And they tried to make this compulsory. And so an act was passed that made vaccination of smallpox compulsory for all infants from 1853. Well, it's all very well saying it's compulsory, but how are you going to do it? How are you going to get hold of these infants to vaccinate them? And of course, many slipped through the net because lots of people didn't know it was compulsory or refused to take the children in because they were suspicious. So therefore, children that passed through the hospital, passed through the workhouse, were all vaccinated as a matter of course, but of course many people slipped through the net, and consequently smallpox continued to be around for a long time after. So actually, most diseases were recurring, and the cholera was a classic example of that. And it came back in 1848, and it was twice as deadly as it had been in 1832, killing twice as many people nationally, everywhere that is, except Sheffield. We learnt our lesson. Sheffield was the only sanitary committee in the country which had the enlightenment to perceive the full extent of their duty and the courage to perform it. This was done without regard to expense, in the firm conviction that apart from the humanity and the course they had taken, the ratepayers will be the largest gainers in the ultimate saving of widows and orphans. So actually it was a bit of an investment for us to spend this money now to save us a fortune in the long run. And it actually worked. Only 76 cases of the cholera was reported. Bearing in mind how many people it was killing around the country. So it was successful. But as a result of this epidemic, there was another investigation and another Act of Parliament, the Public Health Act, which saw many improvements around the country. And although we didn't need it as much as other places, we still saw some benefits. So we got things like public lighting rolled out around the town. The maintenance of roads was again rolled out for the first time. They were cleaned. Ventilation of public buildings was a new concept. They never thought about having windows that opened in public areas. The closing of burial grounds was much needed because they were becoming very full and rather putrid and unpleasant and very unhygienic. Parks were provided green spaces where people could go. Baths and wash houses were much needed, as were depots for soil and public urinals. So we did see some improvements. However, things in Sheffield didn't stay good. Because again, if you remember from those statistics about the rising population, this is when the population of Sheffield tripled. This is when all these people are coming in, overcrowding gets really bad again. Any amount of investment that's put in the town is soon lost as the people keep coming in. And eventually the authorities just gave up and said, what's the point? We'll just leave it for a while and let the population settle, and then we'll start investing. And unfortunately, this had dire consequences, because by 1861 there was another report into the condition of the sanitary areas around the country, and it reported, we have surveyed Birmingham, Stafford, Wolverhampton, Newcastle, Hull and other towns, but Sheffield, in all matters relating to sanitary appliances, is behind them all. Oh dear, we've gone from being one of the best to one of the worst in the country. And so, consequently, they came back to Sheffield and had another investigation. And again, some of the quotes from the time. A plank bridge over the Shee shows dead dogs and cats floating on slimy waters, and outlets where effluents of excremental slush oozes into the river. A mass of scabby-looking cottages, isolated dung heaps, overflowing privies, timber yards and large factories jostle against each other. In the streets, channel are cut in the pavements to convey fluid from every house across the footways into the flowing gutter, while clothes are hanging out to dry across comparatively wide streets. We step to a scene which baffles description, a district of slaughter sheds for nearly the whole of Sheffield, from the boiling house for tripe, slippery with gory slime, to the shocking ash pits below. The sheds themselves are generally so rickety that the removal of them would take very little, and their ill condition adds to the ghastliness of the scene. Oh, does anybody feel sick yet? And not surprisingly, in those kind of conditions, life expectancy was horrendously low. 17 for working class people, only 25 for middle class, and still only 33 for the welfare. It was partly due to the unhealthy trades that people did, the grinding and the buffing and the metalworking industry, but actually it was mainly due to the terrible sanitary conditions. Infant mortality was horrendously high. 1 in 5 infants died before their first birthday. 1 in 2 died before their 5th birthday. So for poor families, you're likely to lose half your children because of these sanitary conditions. And by now, the death rates in Sheffield from epidemics and infectious diseases is the highest in the country. Oh dear, things have got bad. And so we go back to our statistics. Where are the hotspots? Where is it worse? So we set up the population and mortality statistics, identifying cause of death street by street, month by month. So this example is from Pond Street for March 1871. So the statistics it gives us, telling us whether it's male or female, age, so this the first one here is 43-year-old man, he's a table knife cutter, cause of death, acute bronchitis, which is probably related to his trade. But then we've got a 1-year-old girl. She dies of measles. A 7-year-old girl dies of spinal disease. A 26-year-old man is a cabinet maker. He dies of arthritis. How can you die of arthritis at 26? And then we've got a 28-year-old man, a merchant's clerk. He dies of dysentery. And then 2 little boys who die of scarlet fever. Now they may well be brothers. And then we've got a woman who makes it to 65. Wow. But then hepatitis gets her, which is probably due to alcohol. But then, hey, you can't blame her, can you? And then we've got 2 infants, 2 little boys, they both die of diarrhoea. And then you've got a 26-year-old man, he's a collier, dies of natural causes. Again, how can you be 26 and die of natural causes? And then we go back to the infants dying of diarrhoea, whooping cough, diarrhoea again. And if you look at the ages, all the people that died, most of them are infants or young children. And they're dying of things that are completely preventable today. That is due almost exclusively to the living conditions that they are having to endure. And of course another problem again is people don't know what's causing it, they don't know how to cure it. And so consequently cure-alls become really popular at this time because there are so many diseases around. If you do get the symptom of a sore throat or a headache, which of these many awful diseases have you got? You don't know. But take a cure-all, it's going to nip anything in the bud. So consequently, they were really popular. So things like Beecham's pills, Holloway pills, did an absolute roaring trade. In reality, the ingredients of a lot of these were mainly things like rhubarb and licorice, because they were laxatives and they were seen to work on the body, and people thought that was a good thing. You take a tablet, you've got a reaction. Ooh, it must be working, it must be doing you good. But it was actually this fear of death that put pressure on the government to do something about it, because people really didn't know if they had got a headache or a sore throat. Is that it? Are they going to be dead within a few days? And so people were terrified, and so therefore they said to the government, look, you've got to do an investigation. And so they said, right, okay, so they did. And again, they came back to Sheffield, and some of the quotes from that investigation describing Sheffield in terms of filthy dens, swarming courts, intolerable conditions, disgraceful privy middens. The shopping centre in town was described as a scattered midden, which is a bit like a Friday night today, actually. Ball Street Bridge, again, which is in Hellam Island, recorded 1 privy for 60 people and 28 decomposing dogs. What was all that about? And they actually said working class families struggle to lead decent lives in conditions of unimaginable dirt and neglect. And that's not fair. These are decent people, decent families, trying to get on with their lives, but look what they've got to put up with. You can't allow that. You've got to do something about it. So consequently, the government actually agreed with this. And as a result of this, the Public Health Act of 1875 was passed. And they realised the only way they are going to improve the health of the nation is to spend money. And so that's what they did. So over the next few decades, we saw significant improvements in our towns and cities towards the improvement of public health. So some of the things that we saw in Sheffield was the growth of suburbs, trying to get people out of the hovels and the slum areas in the centre of town, get them out into the suburbs. So lots and lots of housing were built at this time. So you got the likes of the 2 up, 2 down terraced houses that were built out at places like Darnall and Attercliffe, Brightside. These catered for people that were working in the heavy metal industries, the steel works. And then you've got the 2 up, 2 down terraced houses that were built around Netherthorpe, Upperthorpe, going out towards Walkley and Crooks. And again, these were aimed at people working in the light metal trades, the cutlery industry, that kind of work. And so people moved into these more desirable areas, and the back-to-back houses had been banned, so no more were built after this time. So people were now living in these, much better quality 2 up, 2 down terraced houses. And so people were being moved out of the city centre, and we tried to do slum clearance. in some of the most awful parts, and the croft areas were the worst, which is the area just behind the cathedral and going down towards West Farm. So, one of the first ones that we did was on Hawley Street, Hawley Croft. You all know Hawley Street? Where the houses were knocked down and these flats were built, and these flats are still there, and these became public housing, council property. These were the first council property to be built in Sheffield. And actually, although it was successful, it cost an absolute fortune because we had to compensate the owners before we could knock down the slum buildings and build the new ones. We couldn't afford to do that again, so we decided to look for a greenfield site and build on there instead. That'd be much cheaper. So we found the ideal location out at Winkerbank and built, again, another huge council estate which became known as the Flower Estate. And again, you can see what they built, how different these houses are from the two down terrace houses that they were building. So again, these were council houses with lovely wide roads, and they're not building the terraced houses anymore, they're building the semi-detached or the 4-in-a-row house. Nice big rooms, lots of windows, front gardens, back gardens, lots and lots of greenery, and so much more desirable places to be. And so they decided that, we've got to deal with the pyramidons. These are our biggest problem. We've got to get all these toilets connected to the system. Easier said than done, because actually they realised there wasn't a system to connect them to. So they had to build one first, and so they built one out at Blackburn Meadows. And so once that was built, then they started to convert all the pyramidons into flushable toilets. And so, that was a huge project. And so they then had to deal with people that did have these diseases, that did have some kind of contagious disease. What are you going to do with them? You need to take them out of their situation where it's going to spread around the housing and isolate them. And so consequently, we built some hospitals. The first one we built was at Winter Street in 1881. Do you know where Winter Street is? That was the hospital. It's still there. It's now St George's, or part of it St George's Hospital, across from the university. And so this was going to be free healthcare for anyone suffering from an infectious disease. And again, used by public money. So if you've got diphtheria or scarlet fever, anything like that, you will be taken out of your home and you will be put in here until you were cured. Now, we had a smallpox epidemic in 1887. We wanted to isolate the patients. We didn't want to put them in Winter Street. We wanted to move them far, far away from anybody else. So we built some little huts out at Lodge Moor and put them in there. Once the epidemic had subsided, we thought, actually, this is a really good idea to have an isolation hospital in such a remote area like this. Let's make it permanent. So, of course, it was made permanent, and Lodge Moor Hospital was built as another isolation hospital. Again, for people with infectious diseases, that was provided free of charge. And also, by now, we're finally understanding about bacteria. We're understanding how these diseases are being spread. So therefore we can start educating people on how to prevent the spread of them. So things like these posters went up around town, again, giving advice to people on how to prevent the spread of these diseases. So, we now go back to our statistics because we're still very concerned about infant mortality. These young children are dying in very high numbers. What we want to know is, are they dying of things that are different to what the adults are dying of? So when we go back to our statistics in 1885, we divide the statistics into the under 5s, the dangerous age, and the over 5s. Is there any difference? And actually, yes, there is. So if you can see these statistics, it's telling us, for example, diarrhoea killed 186 under 5s as opposed to 28 over 5s. So yes, diarrhoea is much more deadly for the under 5s. Whooping cough, much more deadly for the under 5s. Measles, again, much more deadly for the under 5s. So yes, they are dying of different things to what the adults are. They're vulnerable to certain diseases. What are we going to do about it? Well, once we'd identified, the fact they were dying of different things, What's causing it? Why is that? Well, they identified that births are still very dangerous at this time. There's often no midwife or qualified midwife around, and that's got to be looked into. Babies are badly fed because of a lack of education on how to bring up these babies, what to feed them. And one of the problems was that the infants mixture was still very, very popular. But actually the main ingredient of it was opium. And it was found to quiet the baby and to stop the appetite as well. So yes, it's a wonder it was popular. But unfortunately, it did have quite a significant side effect, and they often killed them. So they decided that actually there's many, many causes, but if we can narrow it down to one, which they did, to one fundamental cause, and that was maternal ignorance, which had but one solution: maternal education. If you can just get hold of the mothers, educate the mothers on how to look after the infants, then you're going to eradicate all these other causes. So that's what we did, because this kind of scenario was sadly very, very typical in Sheffield. If anybody again who's done the family history will recognise this as a 1911 census, and this is just a random one that I pulled for Sheffield. Now it's telling us, the address is down here, it's 99 Burnaby Street. Does anybody know where that is? Walkley area, that's right, yeah. Just off Infirmary Road. So who we've got living here? Well, the head of the house is a man called William Drew. He's 32, he's married, he's a coal miner. And his wife is called Eliza. She's 29. Now, it also asks, how long have you been married? They've been married for 11 years. Then the next question, how many children born alive? I mean, imagine having to ask that question in the first place, but infant mortality was so bad that they did. She's saying that she's had 10 children in 11 years that have been born alive. How many are still living? 5. How many have died? 5. So she's lost half her children in that time. And if you look at the children that are still there, who's living with her, she's got a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old, and a 1-month-old. Blimey. So actually, it looks like the 5 oldest children have died. The 5 youngest are still alive, but of course, because they're under 5, that's the dangerous age. So this kind of situation was completely unacceptable. We've got to do something about it. So the Sheffield Infantile Mortality Committee was set up in 1906. And they recommended maternity leave for the first time. Health visitors going round to visit mothers in the workplace, in their own home, to give advice, help and information again for the first time. Provided dried milk and bottle-fed infants during the diarrhea season. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a diarrhea season, but apparently there was. And they also concentrated on educating mothers, and this was the first one in the country to set up a series of classes, workshops, produced a handbook, and gave advice and information generally on mothers, and encouraged them to learn about cooking and first aid and all these kinds of things. And we also set up baby clinics around the city. 5 were set up, and there was one in the centre. And the first one that was set up was in this building here. Anybody recognise it? In the centre of town? Surrey Street, yes. It's the corner of Surrey Street and Norfolk Street. It's now Wicker Herbal. There used to be an art shop for a long time. So it was there to begin with, and then it later moved to Orchard Street, which is now the site of Waterstones in Orchard Square. And in fact, there's a plaque on Waterstones saying that that's where the baby clinic used to be. So we go back to our statistics. Is it working? So we look at infant mortality over a 5-year period. So from 1898 to 1900, it's telling us that 191 infants in every 1,000 in Sheffield are dying. That is a lot. In the following 5-year period, 1901 to 1905, it's dropped to 171. It's still a lot, but at least it's going down. So we set up the Infant Mortality Committee. Does it have any effect? Well, yes, because in the next 5-year period, it's dropped to 138. 5 years later, it's dropped again to 128. It's still high, but at least it's going in the right direction, and that is down. So by 1914, we've seen massive progress in the health and conditions of our town. Better quality housing, generally. We've got piped water into the houses now, so people have got a tap in their own homes. And it's switched on permanently. All you've got to do is turn your tap and there's water. You've not got to wait certain days of the week, certain times of the day anymore. Flushing toilets. Most people have now got a flushing toilet. And even better, a lot of people have now got a toilet to themselves. It's still outside, but they don't have to share with the neighbours anymore. Pipes, paved streets and yards, dustbins, better health advice. More hospital beds have all had massive impact, because there is now a growing recognition that filth, poverty, undernourishment and disease are closely connected. You deal with one, you eliminate the other. However, there was a bit of a setback in 1918 with the flu epidemic. At its height, 300 Sheffielders a week were dying of the epidemic, and the cemeteries could not cope with it. At Burngreave alone, there was a backlog of 200 bodies waiting to be buried. They couldn't make the coffins in time, they couldn't make them fast enough. And again, nobody really knew how to cure it. And so consequently, you know, if you could get a successful advertising slogan going and promote your product, you would make an absolute fortune. And Bovril did. They were very successful at it. With adverts like, Bovril has saved my life again, Bovril versus influenza, Bovril makes one influenza proof. Of course, there's no evidence of that. But, you know, people latched onto it and sales of Bovril went through the roof. They couldn't get enough of it. And they made an absolute fortune. But, of course, the difference this time, although we didn't know how to cure it, we now knew what was causing it, because we understood about bacteria, and so therefore we're able to take precautions into trying to stop the spread of the disease. So consequently, a local paper would put information up like this, telling us that all places of public amusement would be closed at 3-hour intervals for half an hour while the entire place was disinfected. And it's telling us that schools were closed because they're a den of the infection, of course, you know, still are. Tried to restrict the movements of people, and that extra wards were opened in isolation hospitals. So they were doing the right things to try to stop the spread of it. So, between the wars, we see even more significant improvements, because again, as I say, poor people can only afford poor food, they become ill, can earn less money, eat poorer diets and become more ill. But with a rising standard of living, people are wealthier and therefore healthier, because they become more resistant to these diseases. And so, affordable healthcare or free healthcare again also has a significant impact. And just a general better education, public awareness of germs makes us understand how they're being spread. So by now, epidemics, although they're still around, they're much less destructive than they had been during the Victorian times, and mortality now falls by a third. But of course, it's not really until the introduction of the NHS do we see huge improvements, because the introduction of the NHS also coincides with a massive rise in the drug industry, with the development of things like antibiotics, antihistamines, anaesthetics, diuretics, things like that. So, suddenly, we're all patients of the NHS. So now, you know, if you get a headache or something like that, there's no longer that fear that you might be dead in a few days. Hopefully, you know, you can just go to a doctor and there's now a drug available, a tablet you can take that's going to cure you. Not only that, but the introduction of the NHS also coincides with a massive rise in immunisation, vaccination. So, because again we're all patients of the NHS, it means that they can roll out a programme at certain stages of your life to be vaccinated against these diseases, because these diseases are still around. You know, things like TB, typhoid, polio, but it's only the fact that we're now vaccinated against them that we don't get them, but they are still around. Now, that's not to say that epidemics aren't still around, because they are. Some cheery person said it's only a question of when a pandemic will come, not if it will come. And of course, you know, every year just about, we have various scares about flu epidemics. They tend to change the name, whether it's Hong Kong flu, swine flu, chicken flu, or whatever. You know, it's, you know, every year, oh, this is it, this is going to be the deadly one. But luckily, so far, that has not happened. And then we've got new diseases, new illnesses. Remember in the 80s, with all this, you know, scare about AIDS, HIV, again, this is going to be the one. This is the one that's going to prove so deadly. But again, you know, certainly in this country, that's not proved to be the case. Of course, it's proved to be incredibly deadly in places like Africa, but, you know, in the Western countries, that hasn't quite happened. But the most deadly of these epidemics, really, are self-inflicted ones. Lifestyle illnesses. You could almost say that we're too wealthy, we're too healthy, we're too self-indulgent. We've got too much time on our hands. So therefore we can indulge ourselves, we can eat as much as we can, get down there, we drink as much as we want, we can smoke, we can have as little exercise and, you know, really sit back and enjoy ourselves. But unfortunately, you know, that's proving quite deadly to us as well. And that is what the epidemics of today are proving to be. However, I'd much rather have these kind of epidemics around than the epidemics that were around in the Victorian period. So that, everyone, is a story of Puss, Pox and Privies. I hope it's given you a better understanding, really, on what did cause all these awful epidemics in the Victorian era and how it did affect our ancestors and how we managed to overcome it, and also give you a better appreciation of public services and the NHS, because without that, you know, how long would it take for us to go back to these awful, awful conditions that our ancestors had to put up with? So thank you for listening, everybody. If you've got any comments, queries, anything you want to say, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank you.